Great. Well, thank you, Gregory. Also, thank you to Olivia and to Alice for this incredible initiative and for having us here. The three of you have pulled this off, and it's very exciting to be in the middle of it. And obviously, thank you to Anna for a long-standing collaboration. We've been to various places together and want to acknowledge that being in the space with you is fantastic. And a few other familiar faces that we see around the table that have crossed paths over many years. So, let's start by a short introduction. We are artists that understand that there's an art world that exists, but find ourselves more inspired and more connected to all the things that sit around it, to kind of break those boundaries into other spaces. And we've collaborated as two artists in various occasions, other than our child. We've had the chance to spend some time in a place called Sutherland, which we just thought we'd throw up a picture on the screen here to introduce us from a completely different perspective, and that is our collaboration with the sciences. And a long-standing relationship we've had with astrophysicists and scientists in the observatory in South Africa, in the heart of the middle of the country, where there's many international domes that are all studying what's out there in space, but forgetting a little bit about what's on Earth. And we as artists have found a really nice collaboration with archaeologists and astronomers, looking at new perspectives on our own planet and on the people that live in that space, and trying to understand how our practices influence each other and how we find new dynamics of actually creating some form of social change, even if it's in a very small moment, and how we can use our kind of cross-disciplinary practice to make an impact. So fast forward now to where we're sitting now. This project ran for about 8 years in the heart of the Karoo in South Africa, and since then we've moved to Vienna. We both lived all our lives in South Africa. Well, you born in Botswana and then moved to South Africa. I'm born in Johannesburg and grew up there. And 5 years ago, we moved to Vienna for various reasons. And sitting in Vienna, we wanted to take this interest and this collaboration with science and scientists and researchers a step further. And we formed a collective called The Zone. And The Zone is really looking at that third space in between. It's about saying we have silos of art, science, philosophy, etc., and they were established somewhere especially in Vienna, where we are based now, and where The Zone was born, in these kind of cafes where people sat down, had incredible discussions and exchanged across disciplines, and then suddenly they decided, for whatever reason, we need a natural history museum there, and an art history museum there, and a philosophy department there, and suddenly separated these disciplines. And we're saying The Zone sits between, that we're interested in what happens in that dynamic between the different disciplines and how they engage with each other. And not to say we want to make art-science collaborations, but rather try to define that which we cannot define, and that is the in-between. And so every project that we do is an attempt to make sense of that space, and as soon as we do it, we realize that we cannot define it, and that in itself is a really interesting provocation.
So, the members of The Zone are in flux all the time, and it's really trying to be a collective, an open space that encourages a kind of circular or even spiraling way of finding language with one another. At this point, Marcus and myself are the founding artists, together with a designer and curator, Başak Şenova, who's from Istanbul and lives between Istanbul and Vienna, and then Johannes Jäger, we've just lost this, there you go, who is a evolutionary biologist, and in the last decade has moved more and more into philosophy, and so is a practicing philosophy teacher and philosopher himself. So that's the kind of core of The Zone, but our various projects reach out into other collectives and other collaborations.
So what's been really exciting, while we've had many small projects, and we'll get to talk about a few of them, for the last 3 years, Johannes Jäger came to us and said, I've got this incredible philosophy research grant with the University of Vienna, funded by the Templeton Foundation, and I've got money for us to do some cool things. Unfortunately, because you're artists, we can't necessarily say we're making art, which we never intended to do, but rather see how we can kind of fit into the grant application, and a lot of you will be familiar with this, that we have to invent our roles in grant application as outreach or support staff or whatever we want to call ourselves as artists. And so he said, but we have this opportunity to collaborate on a project called Pushing the Boundaries. And it's really looking at evolutionary questions of how the world is understood or misunderstood as a machine, and how we have to think about evolutionary questions around how we engage with the world, more like an organism rather than a machine. I'm summarizing it now, because if I had started a lecture, we'd need a couple of hours about what this book is about, and we could talk about it later. But basically the focus has been for the last 3 years looking at this research and kind of writing an emerging book, a book that's kind of evolving and emerging as we're having these discussions and having incredible dialogues with philosophers and researchers and scientists, and as artists not being the illustrators. So far that's always been the big challenge. How do we fit in as artists into a dialogue, other than saying, I'm trying to illustrate this representation of how this and this works. And then what's been really engaging is having conversations with Yogi about all the potential that he wants to put into the book and into the research and into the story with the researchers, but cannot necessarily articulate it only in words. And so while he's talking, we are making. And while we're making, he's talking. There's an incredible dialogue that happens. And so we wanted to show you a short excerpt of a beginning of one of the chapters of the book called The Age of Machines, where the actual work comes out of a dialogue between him talking and me drawing, and this is a recording of that.
Who in their right mind would publish a book called Beyond the Age of Machines right now? We live in a time of unprecedented technological progress, including the AI revolution. We are certainly not trying to stop that or to turn back the clock. Instead, moving beyond the age of machines is about a change in our worldview. A change that would improve our long-term sustainability, a kairos in its history, a crucial turning point. Interlocking ecological, climate, social and political crises add up to a meta-crisis, the ultimate hyper-object of our time. Underneath all these problems lies a worldview that is based on assumptions we know to be wrong. We are mistaking the map for the territory. We are clinging to these assumptions because they give us an illusion of certainty and control. But this is foolishness. This is delusion. The world is not a machine. The world is not a manipulable mechanism. The world is not a computer. Physics is not computation. We need to move beyond the view of the world as a machine. This is what this book is about. This view is surprisingly recent. It originates with the scientific revolution, which is the first time in human history that we distinguish between living and non-living matter, that we develop what was called a mechanical philosophy of the world.
So this was a nice introduction to what the book is actually about, and a kind of a feeling of how the creative space interacts with his thinking, and how the two coexisted. So his words emerging out of the drawing and the drawing emerging out of his words. But one of the main exciting parts of all of this, and as artists we always realize that we work in these two universes. We work in the map and in the territory at the same time. As artists, the intention is to be connected to what's happening on the ground and making work about that and keeping that perspective. And so this mistaking the map for the territory is a really important aspect for us, and remapping and reshaping that dialogue, especially in today's time, becomes really critical.
And so I guess one of the things that we have to keep coming back to think about, are we currently in the map or the territory when we're looking at various contexts that we're wanting to respond to, is also, why are we doing this? What is the impulse around reaching outside of our discipline and into other disciplines to activate these kind of third space projects? And I think what we keep acknowledging is that we're wanting to reframe the context for ourselves, but also to really acknowledge the connections between these meta crises that are out there and what their relationship to each other is, rather than having the various crises compete for our attention or compete with each other for our energies and resources. It's about understanding the relationship and dynamics between the various meta-crises that we throw up there on that slide. And so in that context and in trying to understand really what is it that we're doing, we came across a very useful term that was coined by William Irvin Thompson and John Verrecki, and they call it Wissenskunst. And so I'm just going to read a few extracts from what they, how they are framing this in terms of what Wissenskunst as this third gap space and place might be. Myth is the history of the soul. Myth here does not mean a false statement, an opinion popularly held, but one known by scientists and other experts to be incorrect. Instead, myth represents the ways in which we express and by which we try to come into right relationship to patterns that are relevant to us either because they are perennial or because they are pressing. The history of the soul is obliterated. The universe is shut out. And on the walls of Plato's cave, the experts in the casting of shadows tell the story of man's rise from ignorance to science through the power of technology. The loss of soul represents the loss of narrative order, the stories we tell ourselves about our personal experience and how it fits into the larger meta-narrative about the world. In the classical era, the person who saw history in the light of myth was the prophet, an Isaiah or Jeremiah. In the modern era, the person who saw history in the light of myth was the artist, a Blake or a Yeats. But now, in this postmodern era, the artists have become what? A degenerate priesthood? They've become not spirits of liberation, but the interior decorators of Plato's cave. We cannot look at them in their current state for revolutionary deliverance. The revision of history is also an act of prophecy, not prophecy in the sense of making predictions, for the universe is too free and open-ended for the manipulations of a religious egotism, but prophecy in the sense of seeing history in the light of myth. If history becomes the medium of our imprisonment, then history must become the medium of our liberation. To rise, we must push against the grounds to which we have fallen. For this radical task, the boundaries of both art and science have to be redrawn. Wissenschaft becomes Wissenskunst. The task is to rewrite our historical narrative in terms of new myths, to create a new narrative order, a story we tell ourselves. And so thinking about what Verrecki and Thompson are musing on here, we were equally interested, being in Vienna, in thinking about some of the most strongly held philosophical ideas that are birthed in that country and in that city. And so Wittgenstein and how he essentially ends the Tractatus is, worüber man nicht sprechen kann, darüber muss man schweigen. That which we cannot speak of, we should be silent about. And we viscerally disagree as artists with that statement. And so it's to say, if we don't have the language for it in a spoken textual sense, how else can we start to express and translate one another in the complexity of it?
And so that translation is something that we regularly tackle, and we can pass this around, but you're seeing the slides up here refer to the content of this book. Published a book and an exhibition in a castle called Das andere Heimatsmuseum in Styria, and basically it's a kind of book of translations, I guess, that take you through this impossible task of creating an ontology of the undefinable. That which we don't know how to translate and how to explain, a la Wittgenstein's expression, is how do certain words translate not only from one language to the next, German to English in this case, but from one concept to the next, from one discipline to the next. And so we've attempted it. As I said before, we attempt these things and then we realize, do they fill the gap? Do they explain what that gap of the zone is? But it doesn't really, and yet it helps us with the next steps of understanding a form of translation and exchange. And this ongoing exercise of creating these multiple languages or trying to explain it does need at some point a point of reference or a root that holds for us what this ontology tries to explain. And in this case, the question of the machine world or the world as a machine, and trying to look at what happens when you compare living and non-living things, earth versus organism, machine versus organism. And what we've got here is a small introduction to another short voice by Yogi. I should have said earlier that Yogi wants to be with us on another screen, and we thought that hybrid presentation we'll replace by his voice on our screen. So he does send his regards. But let me play this very short introduction to how do living and non-living things differ. And specifically in this case, it's without Yogi's voice. It's without that element of conversation, but a different voice. So what you see here is literally the drawing that happens during conversation, that is just captured frame by frame, mark by mark, and played back unedited, and then asked Ngolisile Bongwana, who's a performer, a vocalist in South Africa that we work with quite often, to respond. And so you have this replacement of Yogi's conversation and his voice with another voice that isn't trying to explain anything to us, but responding in a different way.
So inside of the studio, we find there are extremely instructive and useful qualities. In a studio as artists, whether we're on an editing suite or with a painting or a drawing, or even in a rehearsal, there are things that we can do in that safe space for stupidity that we can't do in the real world. We can remove things, we can erase things, we can move backwards, we can undo. Unfortunately, that's not the direction that time and the real world move in. But inside of it, we also notice that there are qualities that are not celebrated in the real world that are enormously generative and rich inside of the studio. And so with this kind of ontology of an undefinable, we began to recognize that there are real tools that we need to remind ourselves of each time we move into the studio. And so we start to describe them as an instrument of instability. In these circumstances of collective and collaborative art making, where we're able to recognize the physical space and all of the entities in the room as equal teammates who are there to offer and shift what is existing in the mind's eye or in the hard document, and bringing it forth into something that is very difficult to hold on to, that is unstable in the room. There's the device that is displacement. What is it to displace the components in the room? Be they individuals, be they the spaces, be they the ideas or the approaches, the new possibilities. What is it to deliberately and in a well-held process displace these things from the center of our focus into peripheral thinking and vice versa? Other mechanisms that we talk about are disorganization as an enormous virtue inside of the studio. So something that we don't promote inside of a school or inside of an office, but disorganization in the studio often gives us enormous surprises that we couldn't have anticipated before we started. We certainly couldn't have articulated inside of words, but suddenly the relationship between two messy elements births something for us as a kind of a gap that we weren't aware of until we physically experienced it. And most significantly, a lot of the time, is to embrace the element of what is unknown. And that unknown is deeply uncomfortable, often absurd, but it's unpredictable. It feels sometimes quite dangerous, but the unknown inside of the studio and certainly the unknowable that gets embraced and loved for its difficult quality is often one of the most generative aspects. So inside of embracing these kind of less used tools that we talk about in studio practice and introducing them to our collaborators, we've noticed that we can really start to, on a bodily level, understand the difference between what is complicated and what is complex. And a lot of the time, the problems that we face as we look at these meta-crises are complicated problems. As we acknowledged even last night in that a little opening roundtable discussion, we know the solutions to many of our meta-crises. They've been put forth and they could be implemented. They are complicated because there are power structures and egos and systems in place that are preventing them coming into their full realization or play. Complexity, however, has a very different quality. It's something that is truly exquisite in its ability to generate and give back. It's not complicated. It's many, many different complex entities working together to make what we are, for example, as living beings. And even one of the evolutionary biologists said to us recently, even the most simplistic bacteria or microorganism is more complex because it lives in the real world than our most advanced technology at this point. And so really trying to understand then what is complexity and how do we lean into it is one of the tasks of the book and the question that we're writing. Inside of that, we also notice that we come to, and we've been invited to speak about what it is to rewild. And I guess a lot of the time, we're using these terms to redo something, but we're also trying to decolonize ourselves, to unframe ourselves, to move in these different directions inside of the problem. And so here in the studio, there's an example of where, as an artist for the last 15 years, I've been collecting things. And one of the things that I tend to collect and document are bones when I walk through the natural spaces in Southern Africa. And so as I find these bones, I bring them into my studio. There's something particularly, they draw me visually. They draw me because they're beautiful. As a sculptor, I know that there's a formal balance and elegance to them that I can't hope to achieve. And so in this case, these bones I've individually documented and try to kind of find a new basilisk, a new myth for myself, thinking about what was the basilisk inside of the birth of natural history, for example, the pushing of discovery around the world. So these are very first little meditations where my individual bones that I often form a kind of physical relationship with through obviously cleaning them in the first place, sometimes gilding them, sometimes threading into them, become other creatures, where a collarbone of a horse becomes a wing, and where my imagination is in dialogue with these individual pieces that have called to me because they are, as an artist, compelling. The other thing that's important to say is that when these little soundtracks and pieces of audio are my own, and they come through my vocal response to the image then that is coming about, as well as inviting other artists and musicians into the process. And we talk about using them as a kind of visual score. So we choose not to look at notation or existing melodies that we might know, and work out what the translation of the visual is into the voice.
So the old world is dying and the new world struggles to be born. Now is the time of monsters. Gramsci's quote here is quite important to us because in the finding of the book with Johannes Jäger, there is a chapter called Death to the Demon. And we know we have many monsters to slay ourselves. And we thought we would let Yogi have the voice again and give an introduction to a particular demon that needs to be slayed.
So how do we unthink the idea that the world is a machine? Before we can do this, we have to slay a beast. That beast is the demon introduced by Pierre-Simon Laplace in 1814. It is a hypothetical being that knows all the particles in the universe, where they are and where they're going. And from this and the laws of physics, it can not only predict everything that's going to happen in the future, but it can also reconstruct everything that happened in the past. It's an anthropomorphized metaphor for the idea of causal determinism. Today's laws of physics contradict this vision. Quantum mechanics has its indeterminacy. There are limits to the precision with which we can measure physical systems. Chaos theory tells us that unless we have unlimited measuring precision, we cannot predict the future dynamics. The laws of thermodynamics tell us that some processes are irreversible and we cannot reconstruct the entire past. So modern contemporary physics is not compatible with this kind of determinism. There's a weaker kind of determinism which simply says that every effect has a cause, but the future is not necessarily predetermined. If we fast forward 200 years, we no longer think the universe is a clockwork. We now think the universe is a computer. Does that bring back the demon? Some computational processes are not law-like, they're not predictable. In mathematics, there's a problem called the decision problem, or in German, das Entscheidungsproblem, which says that you have to go through some problems step by step to see if they're solvable or not. You cannot predict in advance what the outcome is of a specific computational process. Now, some people, they say that this slays the beast, it slays the demon, because if you're in the universe, you cannot predict the future anymore. But that is wrong. It's a fallacy. Because the demon is not part of the universe. The demon has unlimited power, unlimited resources, unlimited time. And even though we, human beings, may not be able to predict the future of the universe, the demon still can. The idea that the universe is a computer, or is like a computer, is nothing but a reincarnation of the old view of the universe as a clockwork. It is more subtle, more sophisticated, and more hidden. But still, there is no freedom in this view. Everything is predetermined in the end. Even though us limited beings will never know this. So we can ask, is this a useful view of the world? Since we are limited beings, we cannot predict the future. What use is it to invoke that demon? What use is it to think of an ideal world in which we have unlimited resources and power to predict, to control, and to know? There is no answer to this question. What we need is a science for limited beings. What we need is to slay the idea of the demon completely. This is the first step toward a science for the 21st century.
And so that's the drive towards a kind of perspective shift, and it's obviously in moments completely overwhelming. Until we remember that, first off, we're in a collective. We have one another to lean into, and the communal thinking and doing also involves a communal reading. And we're reading all the time. And in that reading, we start to recognize that we have better ancestors. We have people who have been with us and are with us now, who are extraordinary thinkers who can be whispering in our ears. And so as we become these readers, we think about who we choose to sort of fill our thread, as it were, to scroll through and read from, and to consider as ancestors who whisper into our ears, knowing that if they were all in the same room together, some of them ancient, some of them contemporary from all corners of the earth, they would not agree with one another, and that's okay. That it's in that listening and collective reading that we're starting to find some possibilities to manifest. And so we have Aristotle next to Angela Davis, next to Tyson Yunkaporta, next to Hypatia, next to Vladimir Mayakovsky, and then Salman Rushdie, Edward Said with Plato, Michel Foucault with John Locke, Steve Biko in conversation with Karl Marx, Franz Kafka with Ludwig Wittgenstein, Donna Haraway and Sigmund Freud, Socrates with Jane Taylor, with William Wimsatt and Hansi Freinacht, Wole Soyinka in conversation with Bertrand Russell, Roland Barthes with Georges Louis Borges, Homi K. Baba and Anita Allen, Mary Midgley with Charles Darwin, Franz Fanon in conversation with Alexander von Humboldt. And so this is a rolling list. Certainly not their comprehensive works are read by us. It's about being able to understand them in the face of the circling, spiraling, complex conversation that we're wanting to elicit with people in the world, and also those some of whom are no longer in the world, but whose stories and whose thinking should still be feeding us as we meet the meta crisis. And then finally, one of these ancestors who's alive and well, Tyson Yunkaporta. But I talk about him as an ancestor in the same way that many South Africans talk about their ancestors. These people who are whispering into the world, into your ear and into the world, and guiding you as you move through it, guiding your choices. Tyson Yunkaporta, for those who don't know, is an Australian Aboriginal writer and scholar who often writes about the indigenous view onto the Western world, which is an inversion often of how indigenous culture is written about. And he ends Sand Talk, one of his best known books, with this kind of, for us it was a question of stewardship, what our responsibility is inside of stewardship. He comments that from his perspective and the perspective of the communities that he knows best, the point of the kind of Western colonizing cultures seem to work in a really backward reversal progression, in that for problem solving they are led initially through action and control, which is they begin with direction or the impulse to direct something. And it's only later, after this taking of action and direction, in the capitulating around understanding what isn't working, that they might come to, at some point, a relationship of respect with that which remains once their direction has obliterated what was not strong enough. And he says, in his mind, the worldview and the process through which to meet a problem that he knows is to start with an implicit respect. Respect is not earned, it exists. It is something that is always present in any dynamic. From respect, and that as a starting point, you are able to connect with that which feels significant and compelling. And that connection allows for a kind of a reflection, a deep reflection. And the final step towards a problem solving, if you were to move in that direction from respect to connect to reflect, is then to know how to direct and what your direction might be. And so that's just one of the kind of nuggets that we pull out of these spiraling thinkers who we're seeing as part of our ancestry, but also part of our collective in trying to activate a third space between disciplines.
Thank you.
Do we have any time? Yeah. So
Marcus and Bronwyn for this presentation. Of course, we'll open the room to some questions with the public. But thanks, I've been very sensitive also with your practice and all this, the importance of translation that is so strong. And also, I might have a question about what you call the third space that you create. You didn't talk so much about it, but maybe you could define more this notion in your practice.
I mean, there's a lot of connotations around the third space, of course. Homi K. Baba being one of the most present, but in our mind, it's quite simple. It's a kind of a visualization of if, in fact, standing in Vienna, our new home, in the physical space between the Natural History Museum and the Art History Museum, that's a very obvious sort of nail on the head kind of thing. But when we were beginning and have always been in dialogue with scientists and people from other disciplines, museologists, other artistic disciplines too, we noticed that there's a gap that you often have to jump over in order to understand the perspective of the other person, or to appreciate or grow a kind of empathy for what they're saying. And so this third space we see as this kind of physical gap that requires this active movement on your part. And I mean, it's often quite amusing, even now, 5 years later, with the zone, which is more than a weekly conversation in a studio with somebody like Johannes Jäger, who we call Yogi. The number of times we will have been speaking for weeks about a particular topic and using a particular term, and then we realize his definition and all of the associated links to that definition and ours are actually different, but fundamentally. That has to do with the fact that in the four of us as the zone, there are multiple languages that are first languages that are being spoken. So we're dealing with Turkish, and we're dealing with German, and we're dealing with English, and there are other languages in the mix. But then there are also discipline differences, where my definition of contemporary or culture is fundamentally different to theirs. And so then we have to try to find that. And so that's the space. When you're in the confusing unknowable or unknown, and it's frustrating and it's sticky, you realize, this is really interesting, because we've been forging ahead in our own minds, each of us individually, thinking that we are making progress, but actually we have to come all the way back to this jump that we have to make for each other.
Part of that is actually the manifestation of the space, if one wants to see it physically, is very often moving out of our minds and our words into a space of making. So the third space is also a space of exploring things that we're not used to doing, and in that getting this discomfort and unease and the unknown and the vulnerability that we feel in the room to be shared. So I'm not an actor. I don't use my voice. Bronwyn uses her voice. Suddenly I have to use my voice. It's a very tricky and complicated thing that I have to do. But in attempting to have a conversation in the same way that she would be with when she's singing or performing in a certain way, I enter into a place of complete vulnerability where I'm giving myself over to that moment. And it creates a new experience for me that I need to feel comfortable with if I'm going to have a conversation with anybody about any topic that is important to us. Because we hide behind all these layers of our silos, our disciplines, our PhDs, our research reports, our grants that we get. We've got all these wonderful tools to say, well, we can't go there because we have to protect ourselves amongst our peers. When actually it's that third space that I don't want to actually call it the third space anymore, because it's no longer space. It's now something else, and it's the zone. So it comes back to this idea of trying to find an in-between zone that gives us a shared vulnerability to take us that next step. Because when we agree on something as humans, it's very different to when we agree on something as artists or as philosophers or as scientists. And that's the area where the language also fails, where our translations are always going to come from a subjective point of view. But our vulnerability needs to take other vulnerabilities into account, and a certain sense of empathy comes with that. And so that's where we play.
I think the perfect moment to ask
Yeah.
to the audience.
Sorry, I'm looking at you,
This
but
moment of vulnerability together. If you have any question, free.
I have a question. By coincidence, I had a meeting this morning with one of the scientists, not this week, with one of the scientists who wrote a paper 15 years ago about the 9 planet boundaries that we are reaching. And he said it's a very complex system because everything is interconnected. It's like a spider web. If you move to the acidification of the ocean and the biodiversity, and everything is interconnected. Then he started to write a paper and to work with not only scientists but also neurologists, anthropologists, to find kind of solutions. He said from a scientist's point of view, solutions are known, we know what we have to do, but from a political point of view, from a business point of view, from an individual point of view, everything is more complex, and before we start to act, some gaps are missing. And then he said, said that he's working with artists and plasticians to try to also to work with them in board of companies or with politicians to fill the gaps also, and also to try to put in place a storytelling, even if it's positive or negative. Then my question is, with the people you are working with, I understood it's scientists, philosophers, maybe anthropologists as well, how do you feel working with the business world or the politicians world as well, and trying to be involved in a way?
That's a good question for you.
Yeah.
As well.
Yeah. I think it's essential. I think our role as artists, and comes from being from South Africa, is that we don't have queues standing to wait to get into museums and to galleries because they believe culture, the way we understand it in a European context, is important. Very quickly one notices that you need to take the notion of what's important to you as an artist to the public. So public art, not in the convention of putting a sculpture down, but socially engaged practice becomes essential. And what's the difference between a socially engaged practice in a neighborhood of hungry refugees, for one example, versus a neighborhood of politicians? Yeah, there is actually no difference. You're trying to reach people on a particular basis to effect some kind of change within their environment. And our way of trying to play with the system to change the system, unfortunately, deals with these power structures that we cannot avoid. And I would say, and we often have debates about this with Yogi, because selling your soul to work with the corporate environment comes up in conversations. So, well, actually, we cannot go back. We're so deep in the trench of dealing with trying to affect some kind of change in our little ways that we can. Maybe it would be great to affect someone that's got a little bit more reach, or that has a different power of voice, and see whether or not there's some form of empathy that you can evoke for the process that we go through. I welcome it. I must say, I ran a company for 25 years in South Africa, focusing exactly on this topic of finding new opportunities for the arts through an engagement with politicians, city planners, a corporate sector. And the effect and change that you can make when you reach the right people is enormous. The chance of reaching them is a whole other thing. And so you spend so much time convincing people that what you do is valuable, and very little time actually doing the work. But that little bit of time, we've noticed as a model, works really well. I mean, it goes as far as to say that if you look at the value chain of an economy, and the creative economy's got a particular kind of value chain that's got gaps throughout it, and you start realizing that actually as artists you can fill other economies' value chains quite nicely, just simply by the methodologies that you apply in your creative practice. But to translate that is taboo, because you're supposed to be an artist. You're not supposed to talk about business. You're not supposed to engage in politics, because you stay in that theater, stay in that museum. And as long as we all go to the museums and the theaters, we're already in a safe space where anything can reach us, but it won't go beyond the walls, because actually it doesn't affect people out there. Plus we can always lock the door and censor it. And these are all models that have been put in place that we can only kind of break down by finding other routes into these people's minds. We sometimes using the word art, I've noticed, in a boardroom. If I say I'm an artist and we're going to talk about public art in your new development of this city neighborhood, they all go, okay, he's the artist. Literally, that's the thing. If I say I'm the consultant talking about creative economies in your urban regeneration plan, oh, that is interesting. Let's talk more. And I think it's that very simple game, and we forget to play that because we get taught, unfortunately, in the institutions, in the art schools, we get taught to think that we are going to be genius artists when we come out, and we're going to make a mass painting and sell it. That time is gone. That's really, truly my opinion. And we felt that time being gone in South Africa a long time ago. And now I'm seeing it in Europe around me, crumbling, and people are still teaching students to paint so that they can sell their paintings, as opposed to talking about the critical factors of the economy. So I welcome, personally, that. And yes, it's a debate we have all the time, especially there was a conference about 30 scientists and philosophers about a few months ago that came together from around the world to discuss whatever, I don't even go into detail, but their world, their academic world. And wow, to try and access that bubble. I was there as the only artist in the room, kind of waving this flag saying, let's challenge these things. It's immense how powerful structure is. And any chance to cut away at it is a good chance. Anyway, sorry, long answer, but I hope it did answer something.
But maybe I also think that there is something that the fact that you come from South Africa, that you knew South Africa, there is something very different also from the point of view maybe we have in Europe and in the United States, the way we consider the thing. The fact that artists coming from Africa or Brazil or South America or even Asia, there is a new way of acting in that field as well, towards maybe politics or social things or business things.
Yeah. Possibly, but what I find, just as a personal reflection on that, I'm a white male coming from South Africa. I don't have to say more. I mean, that identity politics that's attached to that is really complex. And while I had to ask myself the question in South Africa every day of my practice, working in townships, in neighborhoods, etc., where I'm very obviously, I mean, plus I have no hair. I'm like a light bulb. So suddenly, I have to ask myself the question every day, why am I making art? Why is my identity in a neighborhood where I'm coming to offer something? What is my privilege? How do I use it? And then I spent the last 5 years in Vienna, and I'm invisible. I was sitting on the tram and no one notices me. And on the one hand, I think, wow, that's interesting. I've now got a different kind of relationship with the world because a white male fits into Europe. It's easy, relatively. And it's actually completely disempowering. My agency is gone. The agency I have by questioning my own privilege in a context like South Africa constantly had me every second of the day thinking about what my own strategy for survival in relation to others is. So you cannot avoid having a dialogue. You cannot avoid making eye contact, because if you stop doing that, you are the one that stands out. Here, we've lost a bit of that simply because of the homogeneity of our society, and now it's threatened by the outside world coming in, and we all don't know how to deal with having agency in our difference. And I find that an interesting topic. So I think that perspective shift from others coming in to help us get a perspective in Europe of ourselves is a really important part.
The zone seems to be a space where two different worlds or ideas seem to clash a bit, or there's a tension.
Tension's
and I'm
good.
just wondering, do you have a methodology to enter this space or to nourish the ideas that are made in the zone, like practice based, or like, do you follow a kind of path, or is it more random?
Yeah, I mean, there's tools, especially because I'm my other hat in life is very deeply embedded in performativity, and there are tools in a performance practice that are extremely useful in terms of pushing you from a purely severed head space into a full body thinking. And so I know that when I move into the studio just on my own, in order to get into my practice, because I wear multiple hats too, and I, for example, I'm the director of a performance space in Johannesburg, and so I have to be different people sometimes for myself in order to come into a practice. And so I use breathing techniques with ink to allow myself to draw again. And Marcus has incredible strategies for building an environment which is a manifestation of what we're talking about physically in the room. And so when we have some of the PhD students who are doing their degrees at the moment in biology and philosophy as part of this Pushing Boundaries project, we deliberately get rid of all the tables and chairs, and they're super uncomfortable in the beginning because they've got nowhere to sit and to write and to look at. And then we kind of start constructing other things where Marcus will write on big pieces of paper some of the key words, and we'll ask them, to help us build something around that. And he's come to call it the perspective studio, but it's a tool that has people disconnecting from some of the habits that they have that might cause us to not meet one another, or that might make the conflict unsurpassable. And so these breathing techniques, warm-ups that I bring in, vocalizations, and Marcus's physical building of a kind of an installational environment around you are some of the tools that we use, because we know them be useful even when we're on our own in the studio, to get things moving, to build a momentum with ourselves.
Okay. It seems to be very practiced.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's difficult to then show this, for example, because this is at the moment 5 years of practice on a daily basis distilled into a 45-minute lecture, and we're showing you the last distillation, really trying to echo the practice that is in it, where this emerging book is coming out for distribution, and it feels like a contradiction too, but at the same time, each time we watch it or we look at these distillations of the chapters that are being written and reflected on, we know that there's a kind of a learning there that we're hoping to share.
And have you documented this as well?
Yes.
Yeah.
I had a similar question, methodological question about listening, because so for me it was really also just the dramaturgy of this lecture performance you gave us a little bit a taste of this. In fact, that each element becomes a kind of score where the others, I mean the voice or the sound or the visual is a score for the other element, which creates this kind of spatiality of the system that is built. At some point, in a way, the threshold of my attention on the text goes a little bit down, which opens another way of thinking with the other materials, which is a very special experience of listening. And then I had the impression, in the way the text is built, the text also works at some point more like an echo, so on a poetical, in a way, language, which allows the other elements to have another kind of centrality. Not centrality, because I think you are decentralizing the element one to the other, but really allowing to the audience, in this case, another kind of listening. So my question is about your studio, if you use it also as a technique, because I can imagine this threshold between the discipline where you don't understand each other. So the four of you in the studio, you need to find a way of listening to each other, which is very performative.
Yeah.
So this is what interests me. Which is the methodology you maybe have for this?
So the four of us is one component. Then there are people joining and coming and going all the time. And that's where it gets really exciting, because the studio is a nice space. It's not too small. It's like with this green area here where the pillars are. So it's a nice big space. It's got a volume, so you can make a noise, and it's got and it was actually a former classroom in an old school. So it's got all of these qualities that play with it. But more importantly for me is when we then take the studio somewhere else. And that could be the little cafe in Vienna, it could be a forest somewhere. And so we've very often had these experiences where we intentionally think about what is it that we want to talk about, what is it that we want to address, and where would these moments be most fruitful. And so, like I was mentioning, these 30 philosophers and scientists coming together, this was at a venue close to a forest, and the first thing I did is chase them all into the forest with little boxes to create worlds inside their boxes. Freaked them out completely. But when I then walked around finding them, they were busy picking flowers and changing this and thinking about that and building little worlds inside their boxes. And their studio, despite it being in this forest, ended up in the boxes that they brought back into the lecture theatre and put down and said, yeah, it's in there. And I think it's that perspective shift on scale, and not thinking that a studio always has to be this big. A coffee table in a Vienna cafe has proven extremely valuable. It depends on what you're trying to tackle and the conversation that you're having. But I think it's a very conscious choice. And we have a lot of fun material at the studio. That's the other part. Play, and what we call serious play, is a really, really important part of it. So even the you call it a lecture performance, the presentation we did now. I like the idea of a lecture performance.
I love your description of it. Thank
it was
you.
very
There's
nice.
some really
but
useful terminology.
Even that was a play. You know, we were back and forward thinking, and I will interrupt you later. Okay, then you're going to read that instead. We didn't say it, but the gestures between us come from living and working together so much that we almost can intuit each other's space. But when you enter that studio with people who you don't know, and you need to try and find, you need a lot of comforting and holding, and facilitation. And so you need certain tools to do that. And a big roll of paper and a blindfold and a pen can go a long way to do that, for example. Or all of us closing our eyes and making a sound together can start breaking that, and suddenly it's not about the walls in the room, but the head space that we occupy, that you start creating studios or spaces. So there are different tricks that do help.
And just to respond to the one of the terms you use, which sits very close to me, is deep listening. And so, for example, I was trying to digest a text that Yogi introduced me to by Borges, called Kleun Orbis Tertius, Ukbar Kleun Orbis Tertius. And Borges writes this astonishing short story, which is magical realism of essentially a planet, another planet that is discovered in a fake encyclopedia. Anyway, if you know, it's very worth reading, and I've read it many, many times, and each time you discover something new, but you also become confused about a different element, as is often his text. And so I chose, again, when you talk about not being able to listen anymore, there are many points. I mean, Yogi is a pretty voracious reader, and also can sometimes kind of speak at you and just give you all of this information inside of some of these sessions. And I have to escape it sometimes. I'll just start singing like back at him, and that's where some of the music comes from. And it's kind of just like, whoa, there's like my body starts saying no. And so when I was trying to digest this Borges into different things, I brought it as a text to Johannesburg. And I invited 6 vocalists who I've known for many years and who I work with often in different theatre and music projects into a circle with me. Everybody had their own speaker. And we began by, I read a few extracts from this particular text. And one of the great things about this particular text is also that Borges describes this planet having 2 hemispheres. And on the one hemisphere, but they've never discovered the noun. So on the one hemisphere, they speak only through adjectives, and on the other hemisphere, they speak only through adverbs. And in fact, it's something that's quite familiar to a lot of South African languages, like Xhosa. Has far fewer nouns in it than English or German or French, and so it's much more of a doing language than an object ownership language. And so we were, there was a resonance for Olisile, for example, who was listening to this in terms of understanding his own language. And then we decided to close our eyes. And nobody was leading, nobody was conducting. There was no score, but to just see what came about. And for an hour, we sung together, and a lot of this music comes out of that. And it was that for me, after having worked with this Borges text, and one of the actions that I did right in the beginning was to handwrite the full text myself in a circular way as one of the digestions. To be honest, it didn't go in. I wasn't able to process it better in that way. It made quite a nice artwork that people wanted, but I was like, okay, it's a bit cold. This particular moment of reading and then listening to each other, not knowing if you were being pulled or pushed inside of a chorus of 6 other performers, was the digestion.
Can I relate that to Europe in a quick anecdote? Last week or 2 weeks ago, sitting in Bucharest with a group of participants, artists and biologists, neuroscientists, etc., talking about the problem that they have as a community to express their emotions and connect. Because we were talking about bottling things up and letting it out, because I wanted them to scream and they wouldn't scream. And they started telling me about the culture of complaining. and the culture of, and they call it a tsatsa, quoting now, which is the old lady that sits eating her little nuts and pointing at the neighbors and complaining at the sitting in front. And so they said, it's like the tsatsa is our release. So what we did, not unlike Bronwyn's group, we ended up inviting people to join and become tsatsas. And we all this kind of really bizarre group of people sitting in a circle, complaining without words, but like pointing at each other and really giving each other hell, but without using words, but just expressions. And it was the most cathartic experience for the room, because we walked out of that feeling great about ourselves. And it was this collective act of relating to one's own cultural connection to that moment of listening, release, taking in, responding. It was so poetic. Anyway, I just had to share that as a counterpoint to South Africa, Europe, as you said. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you a lot for bringing this fantastic process you are in, with all this interdisciplinarity and tension.